Tonight we begin with the scent of smoke, the creak of swinging doors, and the clink of tin cups against wooden tables. But instead of tales of gunfights or duels at dawn, we turn our attention to something quieter, something steaming in a pot behind the bar, something resting on a dented metal plate, something far less glamorous, but no less essential: the food served in Wild West saloons. Imagine walking into a saloon after days on the trail, dust coating your clothes, boots heavy, with mud and the sun long since vanished behind the ridges. The air is thick with pipe smoke, sweat, and the sharp tang of whiskey. But it isn't the piano music or the slurred laughter that hits you first. It's the smell. The heavy, earthy aroma of beans cooked low and long over fire, mingled with something salty, fatty, maybe even faintly burned. It's not fine dining, but it's food, and out here, that's enough. Cowboys didn't ride into town looking for menus or options. They looked for calories, for something hot and heavy to fill. Their bellies, that meant beans, lots and lots of beans. Not the kind gently seasoned and dressed with herbs, but the utilitarian sort. Pinto beans, navy beans, whatever was cheapest and easiest to store. Dried beans travelled well, lasted forever, and came back to life in the pot with a little water, some heat and time. In saloons, they were a staple, as reliable as the creaky chairs or the barman's glare. The pot would often bubble for hours, maybe even days, with beans soaking up the flavours of everything they touched. Sometimes there was onion if someone had splurged, sometimes a bit of lard or drippings from salt pork. But mostly they were just beans. Simple, humble, and surprisingly satisfying when eaten with coarse bread or hard biscuits. Salt pork was another fixture of the frontier diet, a block of salted, fatty meat that resembled bacon's rougher cousin. It was packed with salt not for taste, but for preservation. In a world without refrigerators, salt was the most reliable guardian against rot. And when a slab of salt pork hit the pan, it hissed and spat, releasing a greasy perfume that clung to every corner of the saloon kitchen. Cut into cubes, it might end up in the beans, or more commonly, in the infamous mystery stew. Now, the mystery. Stew was as much an enigma as its name suggests. Made from leftovers, scraps, or anything remotely edible, it simmered in a blackened pot over a fire that never quite died. The ingredients varied. One day it might contain bits of beef or rabbit. Another day it might rely entirely on salt pork and imagination. Vegetables, if they appeared at all, were rare and overcooked. The stew was thick, murky, and often suspiciously lumpy, but it was hot and it filled the stomach. In many saloons, the cook didn't ask questions, and neither did the patrons. Ate it, you hoped for the best, and you moved on. But if stew was the saloon's eternal riddle, biscuits were its attempt at familiarity. Not the flaky, buttery kind you might imagine today, but simple rounds of flour, water, and maybe a touch of baking soda. Hard on the outside, dense within, these biscuits could last for weeks in saddlebags or on shelves. When freshly made, they were warm, slightly yeasty, and offered a welcome change from the monotony of beans. When stale, they were used more like edible coasters, sopped in stew or coffee to soften their otherwise jaw-breaking crust. Sometimes the line between biscuit and hardtack was blurred. Hardtack was the ultimate survival ration, dry, tough, and nearly indestructible. Some said it could outlast the men who carried it. Others claimed it was more weapon than food, but it was cheap, easy to make in bulk, and required no special handling. You didn't enjoy hardtack. You endured it. Yet out on the frontier, endurance was a form of appreciation. Everything about saloon food spoke to that same logic: survival, simplicity, and the art of doing much with very little. There was no garnish, no presentation, no fine cutlery. Just tin plates, wooden spoons, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing your stomach would stop growling, at least for the night. Even the act of eating was utilitarian. Meals were eaten quickly, often standing or hunched over a counter. Conversation was minimal, unless it was grumbling about the stew's latest mystery meat. Yet there was a strange sort of peace in it all. After a long day of toil, dust, and sun, even a lumpy bowl of beans could feel like a small blessing. Outside, the wind might whistle across the plains, wolves might howl in the distance, and the stars might shine cold and high above. But inside the saloon, with a plate of beans, a dry biscuit, and the warmth of a crackling fire, the world grew smaller, quieter, and more bearable. What was it about such humble meals that made them stick in memory? Was it the flavor? Unlikely. Was it the comfort? Perhaps. Or maybe it was the act itself. The sitting, the pausing, the sharing of something hot after so much cold. Food, in those dusty little rooms, was more than nourishment. It was connection. It was proof that you were still alive, still part of a world that, while rough and often cruel, still found room for a plate of beans and a biscuit. And so the meal begins, not with a feast, but with fire and fatigue, with beans that remember the pot and a biscuit that resists the tooth. It is the beginning of the Cowboys' culinary tale, one that will stretch into meats dried in the sun, coffee boiled to bitterness, and pies that promised hope. But for now, let us linger here, beside the iron stove and the stew pot, where survival simmers and history begins with a humble spoonful of beans. If the beans were the body of a cowboy meal, then coffee was its soul. No saloon meal felt complete without it, even if what they served barely resembled the smooth roast of modern cafes. Cowboy coffee wasn't filtered or frothed. It was boiled, black and bitter, thick enough to wake the dead, and strong enough to hold a spoon upright. The method was simple. Toss coarse grounds directly into a pot of water, set it over the fire, and wait for the brew to bubble and foam. When ready, the pot was taken off the heat and sometimes, just sometimes, a dash of cold water was poured in to help the grounds settle to the bottom. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. But that didn't stop anyone. The coffee was poured into tin mugs, hot and unforgiving, full of grit and character. It didn't matter if there were grounds in your teeth or a burnt taste lingering on your tongue. For cowboys, that bitterness was a comfort. It meant warmth. It meant something strong after long days of weakness. It cut through the fatigue like a knife, and in a world where most things could not be trusted, the brutal honesty of saloon coffee was strangely reassuring. Alongside beans and coffee, there was jerky, thin strips of dried meat, often beef or buffalo, tough as saddle leather, and just as aged. Jerky was the most durable of all frontier foods. It travelled well, needed no fire, and could last for weeks or months wrapped in cloth. A cowboy could chew on a piece for half an hour without making much progress, but the salt and smoke that clung to it brought back memories of campfires, of hunted game, of open plains and narrow escapes. Sometimes saloons served it sliced on, a plate, sometimes tossed into the mystery stew. Occasionally, jerky came from animals best not mentioned. Anything that walked, ran, or crawled could end up on the drying rack. Yet even then, no one really asked questions. They just chewed. Slowly, thoughtfully, like men accustomed to making peace with their meals. If jerky was survival, pie was hope. It didn't appear every day. Ingredients were expensive, fruit was rare, and ovens weren't always reliable. But when pie showed up, even in its most humble form, it meant something. A crust browned at the edges, maybe a bit of apple or dried berries inside, a sprinkle of sugar if luck allowed. Served on a dented tin plate, it didn't need to look pretty. It only needed to exist. To sit down after a stew of unknown origin, after coffee dark enough to stain the tongue, and be handed a slice of pie, it was a moment of luxury. A soft moment. A reminder that sweetness could still be found, even in dusty towns full of mud and hardship. In the saloon, pie wasn't dessert. It was dignity. And if pie was rare, cheese was rarer still. A bit of hard cheese might appear as a side, dry and crumbly, sometimes slightly sour. Preserved in wax or cloth, it travelled about as well as jerky, though with more flavour. It wasn't for indulgence. It was for balance, to cut the salt of the beans, to soften the edge of pork. And once in a while, there would be pickled vegetables, cucumbers, onions, even cabbage. bright, sharp, tangy things, served in jars or scooped from barrels. They brought contrast to the otherwise brown and grey palette of saloon cuisine, and, then of course, there was whiskey. More than a drink, it was an institution, served in small glasses, sometimes warm, often strong, always suspect. It was used to celebrate, to mourn, to forget, and to brace for the stew. Not every saloon had quality liquor. Some mixed theirs with tobacco juice, pepper, even kerosene, but even the worst whiskey still served a purpose. It dulled the senses, quieted the nerves, and smoothed the edges of a harsh world. There were cowboys who drank to pass the time, and those who drank to bury time altogether. And whether it was poured neat or slammed back in a single gulp, whiskey was the saloon's great equalizer. It made friends of strangers, started fights between brothers, and washed down many a tasteless meal with fire and forgetfulness. Behind every meal, behind every pot of beans and bottle of whiskey, there stood a figure as vital as the sheriff or bartender, the cook. They weren't glamorous, they weren't celebrated, but they were essential. The saloon cook was often a man, or sometimes a woman, who knew how to make something from almost nothing. Hair tied back, sleeves rolled, aprons stained with grease and gravy, they worked in cramped corners with rusted pans and warped knives. The heat never left their station, nor did the smoke. They didn't smile much, they didn't talk much, but they knew every face that passed through the swinging doors, and they knew how to stretch a single cut of meat into 20 servings. Their skill wasn't in seasoning, but in salvage. They weren't praised for taste, but for volume. And still, they held power. A good cook could make a bad saloon bearable. A bad cook could send cowboys galloping to the next town. Their kitchen was part alchemy, part battlefield. The fire never stopped, the pot never emptied, the knife never rested. And yet, in that sweat-stained, grease-smudged corner of the saloon, they conjured meals that stitched men back together, one spoonful, one slab, one cup at a time. By the time a cowboy finished eating, beans wiped clean with biscuit, jerky gnawed to a nub, coffee cooled to a mud-coloured silence, he wasn't transformed. He was simply whole again, fed, warm, rested. The saloon was never truly about food. It was about pause. It was about returning, if only briefly, to something human. And in that space between the clatter of dishes and the whistle of wind outside, there lived a kind of stillness, a lull, just long enough to breathe. In the end, meals in Wild West saloons were forgettable in taste, but unforgettable in feeling. They were coarse and crude, but they were shared. And out on the frontier, where nothing was guaranteed and everything could be taken, sharing a meal meant something. It meant you had survived another day. Long before history was written in books, it was written on kin. Long before flags and crests and coats of arms, there were lines, dots, swirls and symbols, etched not on paper or stone, but on the human body itself. These marks, faded and weathered by time, told stories that were personal, tribal, mystical, and though they have outlived the hands that made them, they remain quiet reminders of who we were and what we believed. Tonight, let us drift gently across millennia, guided by ink and intention. Let us begin not with warriors or sailors, but with a man frozen in silence. Ötzi the Iceman was found in 1991, perfectly preserved in a glacier near the border of Austria and Italy. His body had slept beneath the ice for over 5,000 years, untouched by time, wrapped in furs, clutching tools, and carrying within him secrets no one expected. One of those secrets lay beneath his skin. Quite literally, Ötzi bore tattoos, not one or two, but over 60. Simple patterns, short lines, groups of parallel marks, arranged around joints and along his spine. They were not decorative. They did not dance across his skin for beauty or identity. Instead, they seemed medicinal. X-rays later revealed that many of the tattoos were placed near points of stress and pain, knees, ankles, lower back, exactly where a modern acupuncturist might insert a needle. Could it be that these tattoos were ancient therapy, pain relief etched with soot and ash? Perhaps they were both ritual and remedy, part of a belief system lost to the snow. Whatever their purpose, they stand as the oldest known tattoos in human history, delicate whispers from a time before nations, before gods, before written language. As we drift forward through time, we arrive in the desert lands of ancient Egypt. Here, among the sands and pyramids, tattoos evolved from healing marks into sacred symbols. Mummies of women, likely priestesses or dancers, have been uncovered with patterns of dots and lines inked across their thighs, abdomens, and breasts. These were not random decorations. Some scholars believe they were protective charms placed over areas associated with fertility, birth, and female power. Others suggest they signified devotion to goddesses, or perhaps were signs of status within a temple. Regardless of their exact meaning, these tattoos were deeply gendered, associated almost exclusively with women, and almost always tied to spirituality or sacred function. It is a curious thing to imagine a woman in white linen robes, her body adorned with symbols of divine protection, walking beneath the columns of an Egyptian temple. The symbols on her skin were not meant for public display. They were private power, hidden beneath clothing, revealed only in ritual, perhaps even only in death. Egypt's neighbors to the south, the Nubians, also practiced tattooing, though their styles and meanings varied. Together, these ancient civilizations saw the body as a canvas for connection, to health, to spirit, to meaning. From the sands of Africa, we float across the vast ocean to the lush islands of Polynesia, home to one of the richest and most intricate traditions of tattooing the world has ever known. In these island cultures, Samoa, Tahiti, Hawaii, and especially among the Maori of New Zealand, tattooing was not merely art, it was identity, it was status, it was genealogy, carved onto flesh with purpose and pride. The very word tattoo comes from this region. It originates from the Tahitian word tatau, which mimics the rhythmic tapping of the tools used to insert the ink. These tools were made of sharpened bone or tortoiseshell, dipped in pigment and tapped gently, over and over, into the skin with a stick. The process was long, it was painful, and it was sacred. In Samoa, men received elaborate leg and torso tattoos known as pea, geometric fields of black ink stretching from waist to knee, marking the passage from youth to adulthood. The ceremony was communal, often accompanied by chants and songs, with family gathered to witness the transformation. To be tattooed was to be initiated into honor and responsibility. To endure the pain was a test of will and a proof of courage. Among the Maori, tattooing became moko, and the face itself became the sacred scroll. The patterns carved into cheeks, forehead, and chin were maps of ancestry and social standing. Each swirl, each curve told of a person's tribe, their lineage, their deeds. To look upon someone's moko was to read their life, their heritage, their place in the world. But moko was not inked, it was carved. A chisel was used instead of a needle, cutting into the skin and embedding pigment into the open wound. The result was a tattoo not only seen but felt, raised and textured, a living relief map of identity. These tattoos were not taken lightly. They were earned, never chosen on whim. A man without tattoos could not speak in council. A woman without tattoos might be passed over in marriage. And yet, no one was forced. The marks came when one was ready, when the spirit, not just the skin, was prepared. In these cultures, tattoos were more than decoration. They were dialogue between the individual and the tribe, between the living and the ancestors, between the seen and the unseen. How different this was from the tattoos we know today, chosen at a whim, inked in sterile studios, designed for aesthetics or rebellion. And yet, is the impulse so different? To mark the body with meaning, to carry something permanent on flesh as a declaration of who we are or who we wish to be. There is a quiet poetry in all of it, from Otzi's aching joints to the priestess's hidden sigils, from the Samoan warrior's black bands to the Maori elder's carved cheek. Humanity has long turned to the body, not only to survive, but to speak, to remember, to belong, and, though time may fade the ink, though skin may wrinkle and stretch, the marks remain, beneath the surface, within memory, in the stories we tell and retell. Tonight, we trace those stories in silence, line by line, dot by dot, across continents, across centuries, and in doing so, we remind ourselves that we are not the first to seek meaning in the marks, and we will not be the last. As we leave the lush islands of Polynesia behind, the ink of history flows into new shapes, new meanings, and new conflicts. We drift into the world of empires, of togas and temples, crosses and conquests, sails and storms. The tattoo changes here. It becomes a mark of punishment, of belonging, of faith. In some cultures, it is revered. In others, reviled. And yet, always it remains a language, written not in words but in wounds. In the Greco-Roman world, tattoos took on a darker tone. The Greeks had a word for it, stigma, a permanent mark, a scar made with intention. But unlike in Polynesia, where tattoos honored strength and identity, here they were used to shame. Slaves were branded with the names of their owners. Criminals bore marks that could not be hidden. In some cases, soldiers who deserted their posts were tattooed across the forehead, condemned to live with their betrayal forever carved into their skin. To the Roman elite, the body was meant to be clean, untouched, a canvas for sculpted beauty, not ink. And so tattoos, in their eyes, became a defilement, a signal that the bearer was less than whole, less than free. It was not a mark of culture, but of crime. Yet the story was never so simple. As the Roman Empire expanded, it absorbed countless traditions, and among them, tattooing persisted, not just as punishment, but in quiet acts of devotion. Some Roman soldiers began to tattoo symbols of their units on their arms or hands. Others wore protective marks, invoking gods or shielding themselves against bad fortune. Even in an empire that tried to regulate the body, the ink found ways to seep through. Further east, in India and Southeast Asia, tattoos held different power: spiritual, mystical, protective. In tribal communities across the Indian subcontinent, tattoos, known in some regions as godna, were part of identity from a young age. Women wore designs across their arms and legs, often tied to marriage, fertility, or rites of passage. Men bore geometric lines or animal forms, connecting them to clan, caste, or ancestors. In Thailand and Cambodia, the art of sakyant emerged, sacred tattoos created by monks or holy men. These designs were more than decoration. They were prayers, etched into skin with bamboo needles dipped in ink made from snake venom, charcoal, or herbs. Each line was a blessing. Each symbol carried power, protection in battle, strength in hardship, clarity in thought. The process was ritualistic. The monk would chant as he tattooed, breathing intention into every puncture. The bearer was expected to live by certain rules, codes, of behavior that aligned with the magic now carried beneath their skin. To break those rules was to weaken the tattoo, to strip it of meaning. Imagine kneeling before a candlelit altar, incense curling in the air, the sound of slow chanting filling the temple. Your shoulder is bare, your mind still. The first touch of the needle stings, but you do not flinch. This is not vanity. This is offering. This is transformation. The ink is not merely in your skin, it is in your spirit. From these sacred rituals, we now float toward darker waters, the age of crusades, of faith carried on swords, of ink used not for blessing, but for branding. In the medieval Christian world, especially during the time of the Crusades, tattoos experienced a resurgence among certain groups, not as punishment, but as proof of pilgrimage. Crusaders who journeyed to Jerusalem would often tattoo a cross on their arm, shoulder, or hand. It was both a badge of honor and a safeguard. If they died far from home, the cross would signal to others that they were to be buried with Christian rites. These tattoos were often simple: two intersecting lines, a Latin inscription, the name of a holy site. They weren't decorative, they were declarations. I have walked where Christ walked. I have bled for faith. I belong to God. There was also fear in these marks. In hostile lands, a cross could mark you as a target. But for the Crusaders, the risk was worth the reward. In a world where relics and symbols held immense power, a tattoo was the ultimate relic, one you could never lose, never leave behind. After the Crusades, Christian authorities grew uneasy with tattoos. As the Church solidified its control over Europe, it began to view body modification with suspicion. The body was the temple of the soul, and altering it, especially with pagan or foreign practices, became associated with sin or barbarism. Tattooing faded from common European practice, retreating into the shadows. But just as it dimmed in one corner of the world, it began to blaze anew in another, on the backs of sailors drifting through the age of exploration. The sea was vast and merciless. It swallowed men whole, tore ships apart, and offered no comfort. For those who lived on the waves, tattoos became more than superstition. They were armor. They were memory. They were hope. When Captain James Cook and his crew journeyed to the South Pacific in the 18th century, they encountered tattooing cultures firsthand. Some of his sailors returned to Europe with their own tattoos, small designs inked during their voyages: anchors, swallows, mermaids. Each symbol had meaning. An anchor might mean a sailor had crossed the Atlantic. A swallow could mean 5,000 nautical miles at sea. A turtle signified crossing the equator. These weren't just pictures, they were milestones, markers of a life lived far from land. Tattoos among sailors also served practical purposes. If a man drowned and his body washed ashore, the ink might help identify him. If a sailor was unconscious after a battle or storm, his tattoos could tell others who he was, where he'd served, what he believed. Some designs were protective. A pig on one foot and a rooster on the other, believed to ward off drowning. Both animals were often kept in wooden crates on ships, and during shipwrecks, those crates would float, making pigs and roosters survivors by association. The act of tattooing on a ship was its own kind of ritual. A small space below deck, a set of makeshift tools, ink made from gunpowder or lampblack. The hum of the needle replaced the creak of sails. The sting of the needle replaced the slap of salt spray. And when it was done, a mark remained, a quiet testament to a journey that had only just begun. From these humble beginnings, the sailor tattoo would grow into an entire tradition, passed from deck to dock, from port to port, evolving into a visual language of the sea. And as we reach the end of this chapter, we look back at the many roles the tattoo has played: shame and status, blessing and curse, identity and erasure. Across continents and centuries, it has endured, always changing, always speaking. The ink of history is never still. As we leave the churning waters and salt-stung decks of sailors behind, the story of tattoos winds ashore again, this time into the shadows, into the alleyways of power, secrecy, rebellion, and coded silence. The ink now becomes layered, both concealment and confession. We step into the world of the Yakuza. In Japan, for centuries, tattoos carried a burden. They were a mark of punishment. In the early Edo period, criminals had their foreheads or arms inked with symbols that told of their crimes. A thief might bear a character for dog. A repeat offender could be covered in lines too dark to ignore. These marks isolated them, condemned them, made them visible in every town. But in time, those once cast out began to reclaim the ink. Outlaws, gamblers, and members of what would become the Yakuza, the Japanese organized crime syndicate, adopted tattooing not as shame, but as pride, as commitment, as armor. And so began the evolution of Irizumi, the traditional Japanese full-body tattoo. Not just a design, but a narrative, a suit of ink, woven over time, telling stories of gods and demons, dragons and koi fish, peonies blooming beside waves, tigers climbing mountains. These tattoos were not quick, not painless. They were done by hand, with sharpened bamboo or steel, needles, tapping thousands upon thousands of times to drive pigment beneath the skin. The process could take years, cost fortunes, and required silence. The tattoos were worn under clothing, never shown publicly, but known intimately among those who bore them. To be tattooed in this way was a ritual of loyalty, an initiation. A man might begin with a single panel across his back, a guardian deity. As trust within the group grew, so would the ink creeping across shoulders, chest, thighs, arms. A second skin, hidden but permanent. Even today, remnants of this tradition persist. Some bathhouses in Japan still forbid entry to tattooed individuals. Despite the beauty and artistry, the association with crime remains. But the Yakuza were not the only ones to reclaim the ink. In the 20th century, the Western world experienced its own tattoo renaissance, one born not in temples or clans, but in rebellion. The 1960s and 70s saw tattoos emerge from the fringes. No longer confined to sailors, bikers, or prison walls, they began appearing on the arms and legs of musicians, artists, protesters, people who rejected the polished images of society, people who wanted to mark themselves as different, and to do it permanently. Tattoos became a language of the outsider, a statement of self. Punk rockers inked safety pins, skulls, slogans. Hippies chose flowers, suns, peace signs. LGBTQ+ communities used ink as both protection and celebration. Small symbols that only those in the know would recognize, like a violet triangle, a lambda, a discreet anchor behind the ear. These marks were not just personal, they were political. The body became a billboard for causes, beliefs, and communities the mainstream had long ignored. In tattoo parlors tucked behind record stores and smoke shops, stories were inked in flickering neon light. A mother's name, a protest slogan, a broken heart, a phoenix rising. Each needle's hum whispered, "I am here, I matter, you will not erase me." By the 1990s and early 2000s, tattooing had exploded in popularity. No longer a sign of rebellion, it became fashion, mainstream. Celebrities bore full sleeves on magazine covers. Models walked runways with visible ink. Tattoo competitions, reality, shows, social media, all brought this ancient art into every living room, every conversation. What once had to be hidden was now flaunted. Minimalist tattoos, watercolor tattoos, hyper-realistic portraits, names in script, coordinates of birthplaces, the dates of losses, the words of songs that saved a life. Tattoos now told more than identity. They told chronology, a visible diary, a timeline in flesh, one's entire story, carried wherever they went. And as technology advanced, so did the ink. Enter the era of smart tattoos, where biology meets circuitry, where tradition meets innovation. These are tattoos that do more than decorate. They monitor, they respond, they connect. Researchers began developing bioink capable of reacting to changes in the body. A diabetic, for example, could wear a tattoo that shifts color in response to blood sugar levels. Athletes might carry ink that tracks hydration or temperature, turning the skin itself into a data display. Other tattoos experimented with conductive ink, connecting with smartphones or medical devices, creating interfaces between body and machine. A tap of a finger might open a door. A swipe across the wrist might unlock a file. The body becomes a password, a sensor, a transmitter. In some labs, researchers developed temporary tattoos that function like health patches, paper-thin circuits that rest on the skin, powered by movement or body heat, capable of recording everything from heart rate to muscle stress. These aren't tattoos in the traditional sense, but they borrow the language of ink, the intimacy, the visibility, the permanence of attention. Then there are the aesthetic experiments. tattoos that glow under UV light, tattoos that change color with body temperature, tattoos made with biodegradable ink, designed to fade after a set number of years, tattoos embedded with magnets, or linked to apps or responsive to sound. And still, beneath all this futuristic flourish, the ancient questions remain. Why do we mark ourselves? Why do we choose pain and permanence as ways to express identity? Is it vanity? Is it ritual? Is it a need to say, I was here? Even in this age of screens and avatars, ink retains its pull. Even as we build lives online, the act of inscribing meaning onto the body grounds us. Tattoos are not just art. They are declaration, defiance, devotion. Perhaps the difference now is that tattoos have become democratized. Once symbols of marginalization or initiation, they are now open to anyone. The mystique may be softened, the edge dulled, but the ink still flows, and it still speaks. From Ötzi's medicinal lines to the coded silence of the Yakuza, from crusader crosses to sailor swallows, from punk anarchy to biometric circuits, the needle continues to hum its old song of belonging, of becoming. And in the quiet hours, under lamplight or moonlight, a person sits in a studio chair, skin bare, mind racing, heart steady. They have chosen a mark, perhaps for love, perhaps for memory, perhaps for no reason at all. The artist leans in, the machine begins to buzz, the ink enters the skin, and history continues, one line at a time. The steppe is vast, endless, and silent. Its grasses ripple like ocean waves, stirred by winds that carry dust, whispers, and forgotten names. Beneath these skies, where the land stretches farther than the eye can see, a queen was born, not in a palace, but in a tent, not to velvet and ceremony, but to saddle and spear. Her name was Tamiris, and long before she faced kings, she was a child of the earth. Tamiris was born into the Masaj-Te, a confederation of nomadic tribes who lived east of the Caspian Sea. They were horse people, warriors by necessity, roaming from pasture to pasture with their herds and tents, never settling long enough to forget the smell of wind or the sound of hooves. From the earliest days, Tamiris was taught what every child of the steppe must learn: how to ride before walking, how to read the stars instead of books, how to hunt and survive and protect. The Masaj-Te did not raise daughters to be silent. They raised them to lead, to fight, to endure. Her tribe was matrilineal, which meant that power and lineage passed through the mother. Queens were not exceptions. They were part of a long-standing tradition. Tamiris grew up not just as a daughter, but as a future sovereign. She learned to wield bow and axe, but also diplomacy, ritual, and law. The elders watched her with quiet approval. The sky watched her too. As she grew, so did her reputation. She was known for her sharp mind, her steady gaze, her refusal to yield in any matter of justice. She did not dominate her tribe by force, but by the strength of her vision. When her husband, the king, died, she rose not just as a widow, but as a ruler in her own right. Her son, Spargapizes, would stand beside her, but the crown, the weight, the decision, it would rest on her brow alone. Beyond the horizon, another figure stirred. Cyrus the Great, king of Persia, founder of an empire that stretched from the Aegean to the Indus, had set his gaze toward the east. His conquests had been swift, decisive, and often hailed as merciful. He was a statesman and a strategist, known for his tolerance of religion and his talent for unifying diverse peoples. But he was also an expansionist, and the Masaj-Te lands lay just beyond his reach. At first, Cyrus did not attack. He offered instead a proposal of alliance, of peace, of marriage. He sent envoys to Tamiris, bearing gifts and flattering words. He asked for her hand, but the queen saw through the courtly language. This was not affection, it was acquisition, a softer kind of conquest. To marry him, would be to submit her people to his rule, to sacrifice independence for inclusion in a gilded cage. She refused, firmly, publicly, without room for interpretation. Cyrus did not take rejection lightly. He changed tactics, as any seasoned general would. He prepared for war, but not openly. He built a bridge of boats across the river Araxes, a natural boundary between their lands, and sent scouts, soldiers, and spies. He studied the Massagetæ, their customs, their rhythms, their vulnerabilities, and then he devised a trap. Cyrus sent a portion of his army into Massagetæ territory, lightly defended but carrying great supplies: wine, food, luxury goods, and gold. They set up a lavish camp and waited. Tomyris, cautious but not yet suspecting treachery, sent her son, Spargapizes, to confront the invaders. Spargapizes was brave, trained in war, loyal to his mother. But he was young, and Cyrus was not. The Persians feigned retreat. The Massagetæ captured the camp. They celebrated a quick victory, too quick perhaps. The wine flowed. The soldiers relaxed. Spargapizes, unfamiliar with the strength and seduction of foreign spirits, drank deeply. Too deeply. When Cyrus returned, his troops captured the incapacitated Massagetæ with ease. Spargapizes was taken alive. Some say he sobered quickly and begged for death. Others say he was tricked, lied to, made to believe he had betrayed his people. What is known is this: Cyrus did not kill him, at least not directly. But Spargapizes took his own life in Persian custody. The news travelled like fire across the steppe. Tomyris received it with silence at first. Not shock, she had expected some cruelty, but the depth of it, the deception, the dishonour, it burned. Her son was dead, not in battle, but in a snare, not fighting, but drugged. She did not mourn with tears. She mourned with rage. She sent Cyrus a message, short, clear, and cold. "You have destroyed my son with treachery. I swear by the sun, the sovereign of the Massagetæ, I will quench your thirst for blood with blood." The plains knew what was coming. The horses were prepared. The warriors called. The sky darkened, and in the distance, Cyrus gathered his legions, thinking perhaps he had already won. But the story was far from over. The winds howled across the steppe as if mourning, in advance. But they did not know whose blood they would carry. Tomyris stood tall in the morning light, her armour not golden or bejewelled, but simple leather and steel, crafted for war, not spectacle. Her grief was now fury made flesh. The death of her son was no longer a personal tragedy. It was a call. To arms, the Massagetæ were ready. The riders had gathered, and behind each warrior, a fire burned, not for conquest, but for justice. Across the river, Cyrus the Great, conqueror of empires, builder of Persia, marshalled his army. His camp bristled with spears and polished bronze, disciplined and vast. He had won many battles with strategy and patience. He had turned mighty kings into allies, rebellion into rule. But this time, he underestimated something he could not measure: a mother's resolve. Tomyris waited until Cyrus crossed the Araxes River completely. When his forces were deep enough in her lands that retreat would be treacherous, she struck. The battle was not swift. It was brutal, fierce. The air rang with iron, arrows flew like rain, and hooves pounded the earth until the very soil seemed to tremble. The Massagetæ fought not as scattered raiders, but as a storm, a wave of vengeance expertly guided. Cyrus, skilled as he was, could not reverse the tide. His soldiers were surrounded, their formations broken by the speed and fury of the nomads. The terrain favoured the Massagetæ, so did the gods, and Cyrus fell. Herodotus, the ancient Greek historian, tells us that Tomyris found his body after the battle. She ordered his head to be severed and placed in a wineskin filled with blood. Then, according to legend, she uttered words that would echo across history. You who have thirsted for blood, drink your fill. Whether those exact words were spoken or not, they reflect a truth deeper than any parchment can hold. Tomyris had won. Not only the battle, but the right to be remembered, not as a victim of empire, but as a breaker of it. The Persians mourned. The empire Cyrus had built would live on, but without its founder. And for a time, no one dared threaten the lands of the Massagetae again. Tomyris did not claim new lands. She did not carve monuments or raise palaces. She returned to her people, to the open sky and the moving tents, to the rituals that tied her not to conquest, but to continuity. And there, in the quiet after the storm, her legend grew. In later centuries, her story was told in courts and chronicles, often altered to fit the teller's purpose. Some described her as savage, others as noble. To some, she was a barbarian queen. To others, a righteous warrior. The truth, as always, lived somewhere between. What cannot be denied is this: Tomyris remains one of the few women in ancient history to defeat a great emperor in open war. Not through seduction, not through manipulation, through leadership, conviction, and arms. In Central Asia, especially among Turkic and Iranian peoples, she became a cultural icon. Statues in Kazakhstan bear her likeness. Poems sing of her courage. Political leaders invoke her name as a symbol of national pride and female strength. She has been claimed by feminists, by historians, by poets. Some call her a forerunner to Joan of Arc, others compare her to Boudica. But Tomyris needs no comparison. She is who she is, a mother who did not weep in private, but brought justice in public. A queen who led from the front, not the throne. A warrior whose silence was more terrifying than Cyrus's armies. And though no monument remains, no carved relief or royal tomb, her legacy lives in the pages of Herodotus, in the wind over the steppe, and in the memory of those who still look eastward and whisper her name, Tomyris. Before there were passwords, safes, or security systems, there were hands that hid things, held things, and sometimes lost things. But once humans began to settle, once they built homes, granaries, temples, they needed more than hands. They needed guardians that did not sleep, and so they invented locks. The story of locks begins not with steel and gears, but with wood and rope. Simple mechanisms born from simple needs. To keep a door closed, to keep food from theft, to keep privacy intact. Not everyone had treasure, but everyone had something they wished to protect. The earliest known locks appeared in ancient Egypt, more than 4,000 years ago. These were wooden pin locks, ingenious in their simplicity. Imagine a wooden bolt sliding horizontally into a notch. To hold a door shut, in that bolt were holes each designed to hold a pin. Above the bolt, set inside the frame, were matching pins that dropped down into those holes, keeping the bolt frozen in place. To open it, a key, also wooden, was inserted into the bolt. This key had pegs matching the holes. When pushed in, it lifted the pins up out of the bolt, freeing it to slide open. It was rudimentary, it was bulky, but it worked. These early Egyptian locks were large, sometimes nearly 2 feet in size, and used mainly for storage rooms or temple doors. Wealthy homes may have had them too. But the poor had little need, and little to lock. The keys, shaped like long combs, were carried by the owner, or someone trusted. In temples, priests might have worn them around their necks, tied with cords. The key was not just a tool, it was a symbol of trust. From Egypt, the idea spread north and east, carried along trade routes and conquests. Across the Mediterranean, the Greeks and later the Romans began refining the lock. Metalworking advanced, and with it came smaller, stronger mechanisms. Roman locks, particularly from the first few centuries CE, were often made of bronze or iron. They used wards, internal obstructions that required a specifically shaped key to bypass. These weren't pin and tumbler locks like Egypt's. but rotational locks, opened by turning the key rather than sliding it. Some Roman keys resembled modern ones, small, toothed, designed to rotate within a lock and align various parts. Others were shaped like rings, worn on the finger. Yes, ancient Romans wore their keys as jewelry, not for fashion, but for function. A woman might carry the key to her jewelry chest on her hand, signaling not only ownership, but trustworthiness and status. Locks began to diversify. There were locks for boxes, doors, chests. Some were simple bolts. Others were more complex, with spring-loaded parts and traps to prevent tampering. Roman engineers loved puzzles, and their locks reflected that. Some locks even had false keyholes, meant to confuse would-be thieves. Others required keys to be turned in specific sequences, an early ancestor of the combination lock. What drove this innovation? Partly necessity. Cities like Rome were crowded. Theft was common, and as commerce grew, so did the need to secure goods. But partly, it was pride. A well-made lock was a display of skill. A clever lock was a challenge to other craftsmen. Lockmakers were respected artisans. Their work was as much about psychology as mechanics, understanding how people would try to break in and designing around it. Like trap makers, they anticipated attack. Like philosophers, they searched for elegant simplicity. And always, behind every lock was the unspoken question: what is worth guarding? For some, it was coin. For others, sacred relics. For others still, privacy, a journal, a letter, a box of memories. The lock did not judge, it simply kept. In a way, the lock was the first non-human sentry. It did not sleep, did not bribe, did not forget. It stood watch until the right key came, and only then yielded. But even in Rome, locks were never foolproof. Thieves developed tools, hooks, wires, picks, to manipulate mechanisms. They studied the sounds and resistance of tumblers. And in that eternal battle between protection and penetration, both sides evolved. It is fascinating to think that 2,000 years ago, someone crouched beside a merchant's chest, whispering curses, under their breath, trying to decode a mechanism with primitive picks and hope. That tension, that delicate contest of minds and metals, remains alive today. Yet for all their cleverness, Roman locks still lacked something. Mass production. Each lock was handmade, each key unique. There was no standard, no blueprint. And so, while impressive, locks remained the domain of the wealthy, the merchant class, the elite. For the average Roman, a latch or bolt would suffice. For the poor, trust in neighbors or resignation was the only security. Still, the ideas had taken root. The very concept of locked had entered the human psyche. A locked door, a locked chest, a locked heart. It meant something was hidden, something was protected, and to unlock it, whether with a key or a question, was to gain power. Locks had become more than mechanisms. They had become metaphors. And as the Roman Empire fell and Europe entered centuries of fragmentation, the lock went with it, changing, retreating, waiting for the next great leap. As the lights of Rome dimmed and Europe fell into the long twilight of the Middle Ages, the art of the lock did not vanish. It adapted. In castles, monasteries, and merchant towns, protection became more necessary than ever. Bandits roamed trade routes. Conflicts erupted between feudal lords. Secrets multiplied behind stone walls. And the lock, now forged in iron and tempered by imagination, followed. In the medieval period, locks grew heavier, stronger, and more ornate. Blacksmiths became locksmiths, men who did not merely shape metal, but shaped trust. Their forges rang not only with the sounds of hammers and bellows, but with purpose, the sound of civilization trying to guard itself. Most medieval locks were still operated with keys and wards, but they had grown more complex. The warded lock had internal barriers, metal obstacles that only a correctly shaped key could bypass. In a sense, each key became a riddle's answer. Insert the wrong one. and the lock remained stubbornly silent. These locks were often large, heavy, and built into thick wooden doors. Many were padlocks, designed to be portable and clamped onto chests or gates. The keys were long and elegant, often with intricate teeth and hollow shafts, sometimes carved with symbols, crosses, initials, or family crests. To hold a key was to hold a story. But security wasn't always practical. It was also theatrical. Renaissance locks, in particular, reflected a growing love of mystery and ornament. As Europe emerged from the medieval fog into the age of light and learning, even locks became expressions of intellect. Craftsmen in Germany, France, and Italy began designing puzzle locks, devices that required not only the correct key, but the correct sequence of movements, pressure points, or hidden buttons. Some required the user to tilt the lock at a certain angle before turning the key. Others had false keyholes, designed to mislead would-be intruders. Still others had sliding, plates, spring-loaded bolts, or decoy mechanisms that jammed if tampered with. Imagine a merchant's strongbox carved with lions and vines, its iron lock shaped like a flower. The keyhole? Invisible, hidden behind a hinged leaf. To open it required not just knowledge, but patience and touch. These weren't locks, they were riddles in iron. One particularly famous example is the Nuremberg puzzle lock, crafted with extraordinary detail containing levers, sliding covers, and secret releases. To the untrained eye, it appeared sealed forever. But in the right hands, with the right combination of actions, it would yield its secrets. These locks were not mass-produced. Each was handcrafted, unique, personal. And like any great invention, they reflected the minds of their makers. Locksmiths became part engineer, part artist, part magician. In noble households, keys themselves were status symbols, large, gilded, and often carried on ornate chains. They weren't hidden, they were displayed. To wear the key to the wine cellar, the treasury, or the reliquary was to be someone trusted, someone powerful. In fact, the word key became synonymous with authority. A key holder was not just someone with a tool, but someone with access. The phrase key to the city was born in this era, symbolizing not just permission to enter, but the conferral of honor. Even within religious orders, keys had spiritual weight. The keys to heaven were associated with St. Peter. In artwork, angels and saints were often depicted holding keys, not to chests, but to souls. Meanwhile, the symbolism of locks began to infiltrate language. To lock away became an act of protection or secrecy. Hearts could be locked, minds too. Love could be unlocked with the right words, or lost if the wrong key was used. And not all locks protected wealth, some protected knowledge. During the Renaissance, as books became more valuable and dangerous, scholars began locking their manuscripts. A book containing medical recipes, alchemical formulas, or theological treatises might have a built-in lock on its clasp. To open the book was to open a world, and only those with the key could enter. It wasn't only about theft, it was about control. Who was allowed to read? Who could access certain truths? In this way, the lock became not just a physical barrier, but a philosophical one. Some locks were purely ceremonial, decorative, symbolic, never meant to truly secure anything, but to represent the idea of security. A dowry chest, for instance, might have an elaborate lock polished and inlaid with silver, not to keep out thieves, but to show the value of what was inside. In love, locks took on new life. By the 16th century, lovers' locks began appearing, small padlocks given as tokens, locked onto bridges or trees, their keys thrown into rivers. A gesture of permanence, a promise rusting in the rain. It's worth pausing to consider. Why did people begin associating emotion with mechanisms? Perhaps because a lock is intimate. It touches something hidden, something valuable. It protects, but it also limits. It can bind. or it can liberate. It requires trust, a trust that whoever holds the key will treat what lies within with care. And so, the lock became metaphor as much as machine. As the Renaissance bloomed and Europe's cities grew crowded with thinkers and merchants, with secrets and fortunes, the demand for locks increased. But it would take another revolution, industrial and precise, to make them truly universal. That story awaits us still. The quiet revolutions rarely make noise. They happen in workshops, in ink-stained notebooks, in the minds of men hunched over, gears and springs. In the 19th century, such a quiet revolution reshaped the world of security, not with swords or walls, but with precision. Enter Linus Yale. Born in 1797, Linus Yale Sr. was a locksmith in upstate New York, working at a time when locks were still largely handcrafted, each one unique, beautiful, but not standardized. They were costly, inconsistent, and often vulnerable. The growing cities, banks, and railroads of industrial America demanded more. Yale responded. He began designing locks based on ancient principles, particularly inspired by the pin tumbler system used in Egypt thousands of years earlier. But where the Egyptians had used wood, Yale turned to metal. He miniaturized, he refined, he improved. His son, Linus Yale Jr., inherited not just his father's tools, but his obsession. It was Yale Jr. who perfected the modern pin tumbler lock, the very design that would become the global standard. Here's how it worked. Inside the lock cylinder were a series of small pins, each divided into an upper and lower segment. Without a key, the pins were misaligned, blocking the cylinder from turning. But a properly cut key lifted each pin pair precisely to the shear line, allowing the cylinder to rotate and the lock to open. It was elegant, compact, repeatable, and more importantly, it could be mass-produced. Yale patented his design in 1861, and the world was never quite the same. Suddenly, locks no longer needed to be handcrafted for each door. They could be standardized, duplicated, and installed across homes, banks, offices. The key became portable and precise. The lock, affordable and dependable. And with the rise of factories, cities, and global trade, this mattered. People were living closer together than ever before. Tenements lined urban blocks. Storefronts packed marketplaces. Trains carried cargo across continents. The need to protect space, property, privacy, it exploded. Yale's design answered the call. His locks were installed in banks, train stations, and post offices. The Yale Lock Manufacturing Company became a trusted name in an age that increasingly relied on trust made from metal. But Yale was not alone. Other innovators emerged. Alfred Hobbs, an American locksmith, famously traveled to London in 1851 and picked the famed unpickable Bramah and Chubb locks during the Great Exhibition, shattering British pride and forcing designers to think harder. Competition fueled innovation. By the late 19th century, companies like Master Lock began producing combination locks, mechanisms that used rotating dials and internal discs instead of keys. These were popular in schools, lockers, and military use, where key management was difficult. The 20th century saw even greater expansion. Padlocks with hardened shackles, deadbolts for homes, safe locks with relocking mechanisms in case of tampering. Key duplication became a service industry in itself. Locksmiths stood on every street corner, offering emergency solutions and silent guardianship. Security had gone from artisan craft to industrial necessity. But with standardization came new challenges. What was once a personal key, unique and carefully made, became one of thousands cut in the same pattern. Burglars no longer needed hammers. They needed patience and picks. Thus, the cat-and-mouse game intensified. High-security locks emerged. Medeco, multi-lock, with angled cuts, rotating pins, and complex keys. Some incorporated magnetic elements. Others required electronic fobs. And always, the question returned. How do we stay one step ahead? Linus, Yale's humble cylinder had evolved, but its spirit remained. It was not about perfection. It was about probability, the idea that a correctly shaped object held by the right person could unlock safety. By the mid-20th century, locks were embedded in everything: homes, cars, luggage, desks. Children wore keys on shoelaces. Parents tucked spares under flower pots. Offices issued brass passes to authority. Locks had become invisible in their omnipresence, taken for granted, expected. But behind every silent click, a lineage lived on. The 21st century opened not with a door, but with a screen. And as the world digitized, our words, our money, our memories, so too did our locks. No longer content with brass and steel, modern humans began seeking convenience and invisibility. The key became a code, the lock, a signal, and the door, a decision made not by metal tumblers, but by algorithms and sensors. The first wave of smart locks emerged quietly, designed to supplement, not replace. Electronic keypads on front doors, hotel cards with magnetic strips, office access badges. These were not yet connected to the internet, but they were already changing the relationship between person and place. You no longer needed a physical key to gain entry. You needed the right pattern, the right swipe, the right timing. And then came wireless. Smartphones became master keys. Bluetooth locks arrived, ones that opened as you approached, sensing your device. Then came Wi-Fi-enabled locks, controllable from apps, letting homeowners unlock doors for delivery people while still at work, or grant access to guests with temporary codes. Biometric locks followed. Fingerprint readers on safes and office doors, facial recognition systems at border controls. Each person's body became both lock and key. No need to remember a passcode. Your skin was the password. These systems promised ease, but also raised questions. What happens if your fingerprint is compromised? Unlike a password, it cannot be changed. What happens when the server goes down, when the battery dies, when the app crashes? In replacing mechanical flaws with digital ones, we didn't eliminate vulnerability, we changed its shape. Still, the adoption grew. Smart locks became sleek, silent, and interconnected. They integrated with home assistants, cameras, alarms. Your front door could now greet you with voice, track entries, and lock itself at night. The door was no longer a threshold, it was an interface. Some smart locks allowed remote monitoring. Parents could check if their children arrived home on time. Managers could log staff entry by time and location. The lock became not only gatekeeper, but historian, recording every arrival and departure with quiet precision. But with knowledge comes risk. Hackers proved that digital locks could be fooled through spoofed signals, software flaws, or intercepted data. The trust we once placed in hardened steel now had to be placed in firmware updates and encryption protocols. Still, the trend continued. Startups emerged offering locks with voice unlock, retina scans, or even gesture recognition. Others experimented with temporary ink tattoos that transmitted wireless codes. Still others developed implantable RFID chips, grains of rice embedded beneath the skin, used to open doors, log into computers, even pay for drinks. For some, this was exciting. For others, unsettling. Where once we hid keys under rocks, now we carried them in our blood. In high-security settings, airports, data centers, research labs, multi-factor authentication became standard. A locked door might require a badge, a fingerprint, and a spoken phrase. The point was no longer to block brute force. It was to verify identity uniquely and reliably. But beneath the innovation lay a shift more philosophical than technical. The ancient lock was simple. You held something, and it opened something. Today, you are something. Your face, your voice, your movement, your presence. The door no longer asks, "Do you have the key?" It asks, "Are you who you claim to be?" This evolution mirrors deeper societal changes. Our lives have become networks, social, digital, cloud-based. The boundaries we once defined with fences and doors are now defined with passwords, permissions, and privacy policies. Locks have followed us into the virtual world. Your email is locked, your photos, your memories, your identity, each with passwords, biometric gates, two-factor codes. The old chest with the iron lock has become a smartphone with encrypted files. The key is invisible, but the principle remains. Protect what matters. Yet, in this flood of access and control, something quiet is lost. The tactile, the ritual, the feel of the key sliding into place, the sound of a bolt drawn home, the satisfying weight of an old lock turning. Smart locks may glow, they may whisper in polished tones, but they do not click. They do not echo centuries of metal meeting metal. They lack that sound of assurance. And so, some still keep old keys on their ring. A backup, a memory, a link to something more physical, more human. Because in the end, every lock is a mirror, not just of our fears, but of our hopes. We don't just want to keep danger out. We want to hold peace in. We don't just guard things, we guard meaning. And the locks we build, whether made of wood, brass, or code, are reminders that some things are still worth protecting. A lock is never just a lock. It is an idea, a declaration, a whisper that says, "This matters." As we come to the end of this journey, from wooden bolts in Egyptian tombs to retinal scans in silent foyers, one truth lingers. Humanity has always tried to hold on to something, to someone, to a space, a secret, a story. And wherever there was a need to hold, there came the need to protect. We lock doors to keep out harm, but we also lock drawers to hide letters. We lock diaries so memory remains ours. We lock locket clasps that carry photographs of the lost. Every lock, no matter how small, asks the same silent question. What do you wish to keep close? The locks of history were forged by necessity, but over time, they became symbols of safety, of trust, of transition. A locked chest is not only closed, it is waiting. A locked door is not only a barrier, it is a promise that what lies behind it will be found intact, that no one has crossed the threshold but you. There is poetry in that. In ancient times, a key was often passed from one hand to another in silence, not tossed, not dropped, handed over, slowly, deliberately. That gesture held weight. It meant access, yes, but more than that, it meant trust. It meant you were welcome. Today, our keys are digital, invisible. We send access codes via text. We click grant or revoke without looking up. But the meaning beneath it all remains unchanged. This space was mine, and now I choose to share it, or not. Locks are also about absence. They mark what is no longer there. The locked room of a child who's grown. The locked suitcase no one opens after someone's gone. The door we never unlock again. There's grief in that, but also reverence. To lock something is not only to protect it, it is to honor it, to say, this was important, this deserves silence, this deserves care. Sometimes we even lock ourselves. We close parts of our hearts, our memories, our hopes, waiting for the right moment or the right person to unlock them. We don't always carry keys to those places, but we remember where the doors are. And just as we lock, we unlock. We hand someone a key to our apartment. We share a password to a private journal. We open the box of old letters. And in doing so, we offer something more than access. We offer belonging. In the end, locks are not about paranoia. They are about belief. Belief that safety is possible, that privacy has value, that some things, though small, though fragile, are worth guarding. So tonight, as the world quiets and the last light dims, you might hear the faintest sound in the distance, The turn of a key, the soft snick of a bolt sliding home. A lock, closing not in fear, but in peace, because some part of us still believes in safe places, still believes in the hush that follows a closing door, and still, quietly, believes in keeping what we love safe. So here we are. After desserts and saloons, ships and needles, nomads and keys, we've come to the final resting place of our story. A space not guarded by gates but by stillness, not sealed by locks but by dreams. Tonight, we've wandered through time, not in haste, but in hush. We followed the smell of beans in dusty saloons, sipped bitter cowboy coffee in tin cups, and saw hope served as a slice of pie. We watched the ink of humanity flow from the skin of Ötzi to the sacred temples of Polynesia, across Roman foreheads and crusader arms, sailor chests and biometric scans. We stood beside a queen on the steppe who buried her son and defeated an empire, and we turned the tumblers of time from wooden bolts in Egypt to smart locks glowing blue in quiet hallways. But none of this was meant to thrill. It was meant to hold you gently in a world that doesn't rush, in a space where the stories are slow, the voice is low, and the doors always soft when they close. There is something precious about stories that don't shout, stories that unfold like a blanket at the end of a long day. They ask for nothing. They demand no attention. They only invite you in. And if you've made it here, still listening, still breathing softly beneath covers or stars, then you already know. History is not always grand. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's the sound of stew bubbling or the scrape of ink beneath the skin. Sometimes it's a woman who says no to a king. Sometimes it's the lock that clicks shut for the night. And the beautiful thing is, we're all part of it. Your story, like theirs, is etched somewhere. Perhaps not in books, but in breath. In the rhythm of the life you've built. In the objects you hold close. In the things you protect and the things you choose to unlock. So before we say goodnight, let us tie the final thread. You are safe here. The doors are closed, the locks have held, and the winds outside have quieted. You've walked across centuries, across continents, and now you rest. Thank you for being here, for listening, for letting your mind drift through old places, slow voices, and forgotten corridors. If this helped you sleep, or simply kept you company in the quiet, then it's done what it was meant to do. If you enjoyed this long, slow journey, consider leaving a quiet thumbs up. Subscribe if you'd like to wander with us again. Share it with someone who might also need a little calm. No rush, no pressure, just the gentle click of yes, and now truly, the story ends. But perhaps the dreaming begins. Good night.